I'm going to, just a little bit, turn it over to Henrik Daae, who you can tell is not here in person, nor is Nicolai, one of our speakers. The pandemic continues to enter snafus into our best plans, right? And so they wanted to be here. They sent their colleagues, but it's close, that's right. So it's going to be a hybrid version of the event this morning. But before I turn to Henrik, who's going to give an overview of the work that they're doing in Norway, I wanted to just point out that there are a couple of unique things about this morning. One of them is that it's going to be in kind of a flash talk style. So the talks are just going to be about 10 minutes each. We'll have about 5 minutes after each talk, which you'll know will be quite a summary and condensing of a bigger research paper or project, as Tormod will be sharing. And then after all 4 of the talks, and with a little 5-minute discussion after each one, we'll have about 15 minutes that we'll be able to open it up to a more general Q&A that I might help moderate, I might not, we'll see how things go. So that's one unique thing. The other unique thing is that one of the missions of the center, which we're going to be celebrating the gift, the endowment gift, just in a few days here, but one of the missions and goals of the center will be to be creating intellectual spaces that bring together practitioners and researchers together in the same room. And so if you look around you today, I hope you recognize some of your colleagues. I hope you don't recognize some of the others, but they are your colleagues. And they are here because they care about child thriving, and we have many outstanding professionals in the BC community and more largely that are across these different fields, research and practice and policy and other fields that we think can be working together in a way and learning together in ways that we haven't yet made really taken advantage of. And so thank you for being here and for being you. And so with that, I'm going to see if I can transition to Norway. Henrik Daae, who is professor in the Faculty of Educational Sciences at the University of Oslo. He's also co-director of the Center for Equality in Education, which he'll tell you about. And most importantly, has been my great colleague for about 15 years, and just delighted to have him leading this group here, even if from afar. So, and some of you, by the way, know Henrik because he was here for a sabbatical. It was supposed to be a year. That was 2019-20, and so we had a little interruption there. They had to head home early, but still had a wonderful time with him. So, Henrik, take it away.
Thank you very much, Eric. I'm really sorry to not be with you in person. Second time, Corona disrupts a visit to Boston College, but such is life. I'm glad we have the group. Thank you very much, Eric, for taking the initiative for this symposium, and to the very Walsh Center for Thriving Children for hosting it. I will provide you with a very brief description of the past, present, and future of the work you'll hear more about in a few minutes. In 2018, I was awarded with a research grant from the European Research Council with this project, socioeconomic gaps in language development and school achievement, mechanisms of inequality and opportunity. And at the beginning of that project, I was fortunate to spend, as Eric said, the academic year of 2019-2020 as a visiting scholar at the Lynch School, which was a fabulous place to start developing this work. The project has a threefold aim, which is to identify mechanisms fostering inequality in educational outcomes, both in the family and in the neighborhood. It's to test if universal early childhood education and care improves opportunities for disadvantaged children. And then finally, to estimate the costs of social inequalities and benefit costs of early childhood education and care. We have been running the project then since 2019, and we have one more year to go with our funding. we'll just briefly present the team, not person by person, but the team we have become over these years. As you see, we are many people involved, some in part, some in full-time positions. Please note the interdisciplinarity of our team, which has provided a very, very exciting venue for discussions and research, which you will see examples of. So we are psychologists, developmental psychologists, sociologists, economists. We have a quantitative geneticist, educational researchers. And with the project, we have really been able to blend our perspectives into our joint work, which has been a very exciting experience. This work has also led forward to what will be the future, and which I hope will be a interesting opportunity for collaboration with your center. We were last year awarded a 10-year grant for the Center for Research on Equality in Education, awarded by the Norwegian Research Council. So we are opening the center officially this year, and at least from the get-go, we will be 14 full-time faculty members and altogether 60 staff members, including PhD students, postdocs, temporary research positions. And we have a total budget over the 10-year period of approximately $30 million current exchange rate. So we have ambitions with the center. The research we will undertake in this center will follow three main strands. And the first is to a great extent an extension of the ECO project, where we will identify barriers to equality in education. The second strand, which may be mostly related to your center, is intervening on barriers. And finally, we will have a strand addressing key methodological challenges, where we have a group of psychometricians and methodologists, not unlike the measurement center at BC. And one of our main goals is to integrate all these three strands into a more coherent thinking, trying to solve this, essentially the problems relating to equality in education. We have already had Boston College and the wider Harvard academic community involved in this. Eric is a part-time professor in the center. We have been very fortunate to get Henry Brown and Richard Burnett from Harvard to join our International Advisory Board, and they've also provided valuable feedback throughout the application process. And Eric and I have intentions of establishing collaboration with the Mary Walsh Center for Thriving Children, where this session this morning will hopefully be one of the starting points for thinking future collaboration in many different areas of where we have common interests. I will then briefly present the speakers of today's symposium. Astrid Sandsør, she is an associate professor at the University of Oslo. She's an economist working in school education and is primarily doing research on educational policy across all paths of early life, at least ranging from early education throughout high school. Nicolai Borgen is associate professor currently at Oslo Metropolitan University. He's a sociologist and recently qualified to the final for receiving a grant similar to the one I received 4 years ago. So we are hopeful that more money is coming our way for doing more research. Gülbin Sengul-Inal is a PhD student in our faculty. She's a psychologist and has spent the last couple of years diving deeply into the mechanisms linking family income to child development, which we will hear more about later. And then finally, Tormod Bøe is not formally affiliated with my research project. But a good friend and colleague, he is a professor at the psychology department at the University of Bergen. Tormod is a member of the Norwegian government's expert group on advising how to reduce the burden of growing up in poverty, where I'm also a member. So you have, for my view, very exciting speakers in front of you. So I'll leave this over to Astrid. Thank you very much.
All right, Astrid.
There, yeah. Perfect. Well, I'm really excited to be here, first of all, so thank you for having me. So what I'm going to be presenting to you today is a paper that we recently got published in Educational Researcher. And it's together with Henrik, who you just heard from, and also Lynn Caroli, who is an economist, such as that I am as well, and Eric Deering, who you of course all know. The background for this is that we all know that there are inequitable chances for educational success, and that's an endemic concern. We don't really know how to solve that problem, and it has lasting consequences both for the individuals who experience this inequality, but also for families and society at large. And we have these socioeconomic achievement gaps, and we find them in every country. And what we see is that whenever we try to measure them, they are large, they are concerning, but we don't really know that much about how they develop over time, both within cohorts and across cohorts. So the studies that exist, they have been trying to look at this, but they find differing results often. And it's kind of unclear when we see these papers whether this is due to using different samples, whether it's due to measurement error from what they're using to estimate the achievement gaps. They could be using different estimation methods. They can have different outcome measures as well. And they could be using a different measure for the SES background variable. And all of these things mean that when one study will claim that achievement gaps are growing and another study is claiming that achievement gaps are stable, we don't really know why they're finding that difference, and it could be any one of these things. So what are achievement gaps? Well, here's sort of a simple illustration of what we can think of when we think of achievement gaps, and that's basically that you rank all the population into bins of 10 people. And then what we often do is we look at the achievement gap between the 90th and 10th percentile. So basically, how are children doing when we look at the children who are at the 10th percentile compared to children at the 90th percentile of the distribution? And we find these children either from families where we rank them by family income, that gives us the income achievement gap, or education, which gives us the education achievement gap. And what we're interested then is finding out what happens to this difference as children age through the educational system, and also what happens to this difference over time using the same test. So this is not new, these debates about whether they're growing or not, and there's actually kind of a famous debate here in the US that they've named the Reardon-Honishek clash. They both work at Stanford, and they do not agree on what has been happening over the past 50 years. And it should be a simple exercise, right? You're just measuring the achievement gap at the 10th percentile, at the 90th percentile, so why are they reaching different conclusions? And Chmielewski says that it raises a lot of questions, and until some of those questions are answered, the debate will remain unsolved. So what do we try to do? Well, we try to answer some of those questions. So first of all, the US may be a special case. So there's interest also in looking beyond US, because in the US you have few public support system, you have human and financial capital that are closely linked, and you also have large and widening wealth and income gaps. So there's interest also in looking beyond the US and seeing whether these patterns are also present in other countries. But when studies have looked at other countries, also there we see the same tendency of varying patterns. It's not like you can go to one country and say this is what it looks like here, this is what it looks like there. There are differences. So what's our contribution? Well, this is my slide with we have amazing register data in Norway. So we have high quality population level data from the national registers, and they give us precise measures for test scores, for grades, for parental income, from the tax registers, and also for their educational level. And this actually allows us to disentangle the consequences of the sample, the estimation method, the different uses of SES measure, and also investigate immigration as a potential cause for why we're seeing these differences. So we have the data measured from 2007 to 2018, which includes about 1 million students, and covers 18 cohorts, because we're testing at different ages, born between 91 and 2008. And there are about 60,000 students per cohort in Norway. And another interesting feature about our data is that we're looking at both low and high stakes outcomes. So the national tests that we have in 5th grade and 8th grade, they don't matter for the students. Like, they're used a bit for accountability, but not really that much. But then we also have these grades in 10th grade that are very crucial for students because they use them to apply for high schools. So we have both these low stakes and high stakes outcomes. And the other thing that is our contribution is that we're actually looking at Norway, a wealthy welfare state. And why is that interesting? Well, because we're doing a lot of the things that we're all hoping to do in the US. We're already doing them. We have a low income inequality, we have a strong social security net, we have an inclusive and universal education system, and we have almost all students in public schools where they have a common curriculum and they attend the neighborhood school. And there's a comprehensive school system with no tracking, no grade promotion or retention, and very little ability grouping. So with all of this going on, what does inequality look like when we're checking all of these boxes? Well, let's go straight to the results. So here are the achievement gaps by parental income. And what we're seeing is a lot of worrying patterns. So the first thing is that we see that as we go from grade 5, that's the bottom line, to grade 8, that's the middle line, to grade 10, that's the grades that are measured when you leave lower secondary school, we see an increasing achievement gap. So we see here on the left side, it's measuring the standard achievement gap and standard deviation, and see that it's increasing like from 0.6 to 0.8-ish as we go through the educational system. On the left side, we're seeing the results for reading, and on the right side, we're seeing the results for mathematics. So it's happening for both subjects. And the other thing that is also worrying us is, of course, this trend, that we're seeing that it's increasing over time. So when we started measuring this in 2007, it was at like 0.6 or 0.7, depending on what we were measuring. But as we're moving towards 2018, it's increasing. So what could be happening during this time period that's creating this increasing achievement gaps in a very recent time period, actually? So what we do then is we decompose this into the 90-50 gap and the 50-10 gap, which gives us also an interesting result. And that's that we see that it's quite stable at the top, but it seems to be increasing at the bottom. And this is actually in contrast to the results from Reardon for the US, where you were seeing the increase at the top of the distribution. So something is happening at the bottom of the distribution in Norway. And we don't exactly understand the mechanisms yet, but it's very worrying. And we see this increasing achievement gap at the bottom. So what then when we look at the achievement gaps for parental education? Well, here in contrast, they're very stable. So we do see the same increase, that the achievement gaps are increasing as we age through the educational system. But in contrast to education, it's much more stable. So the levels are higher, but it's stable over time. So what is this telling us? It's telling us that the SES measure matters. So when you measure by educational income, you're seeing a completely different pattern than when you're measuring by parental education. So what else do we do? Well, we try to use robustness tests to see what if these results hold when we're changing the specification. We do scaled national test scores, we see the same results. We try to account for missing test scores, and we see lower levels, which we would expect, but same trend. We follow the same sample over time, so now we can actually look at the same student over time instead of just looking at the cohorts. And as they progress through the educational system, we're seeing the same tendency, that it's growing as they age. And we also account for migration, and as expected, this lowers the levels, but it's also the same trend of increasing inequality in parental education. So what does this all mean? Well, it means that there are considerable socioeconomic achievement gaps, even in a country like Norway. The achievement gaps by both parental income and parental education are large, and they're equivalent to about 2 or 2.5 years of schooling. And they increase by grade level from about 10 percentage points from 5th to 8th grade, and then another 10 percentage points from 8th to 10th grade. And they're increasing over time for parental income, equivalent to about 3 to 4 months of schooling. And this is driven by a decrease at the bottom. And unfortunately, what this tells us is that there seem to be limitations to what you can achieve through the educational system in equalizing opportunity. So even when you're checking all the boxes by what we're doing right in Norway, we still see these large and even increasing achievement gaps as you go through the educational system. And it really just makes it clear that we need to better understand these mechanisms of what's going on, which we of course hope to do in this new center. And it also poses a worrying question about what will happen to income inequality in the future. Because these students, of course, are still young, and what will happen when they enter into the labor force? And are we then going to see even greater increases in income inequality for the next generation? Thank you.
Exactly 10 minutes. Exactly, I'm not kidding, it's exactly 10 minutes. So yeah, we've got about 5 minutes of questions for Astrid about this paper, about the context of Norway, things that you weren't clear. Jump in. Yes, Henry.
Thank you. This is very, very, very interesting. Let me add another complexity, and that is that when we try to compare achievement gaps across different grades, just using the scaling may not capture all of the differences. So for example, there could be differential ceiling and floor effects at the different grades, so that some of the measurement issues might come into play. Probably not to explain what you're saying entirely, but maybe partial explanation. The other thing is that the PIAC, Program of International Assessment of Adult Competencies, shows that in all countries there's a very wide range of cognitive skill within each level of educational attainment. And so it would be really interesting if you had a measure of parental cognitive skills that, to complement either income or educational level, because the cognitive skills may, in fact, explain some of the differences in terms of the household support for academic achievement, and might account for at least some of the achievement gap that you're seeing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think we have to think about measurement when we're doing these exercises, particularly when we get to this descriptive world. So even when we're comparing within cohorts taking the test at the same time, there are, of course, concerns when we're trying to compare a 5th grade test to an 8th grade test, and we have to absolutely think about that. And I also want to add that when we're looking at parental or achievement gaps by parental income, that measure is quite simple. Like we can just look at that and that's easy to estimate. It's not the same when we're looking at parental education, because it's these measures that you reach the threshold of 10 years of education, 13, 15. So we're sort of trying to estimate that in a good way, but we're a little bit more uncertain about how to, the interpretation has to be with a bit more care when we're looking at that. And I absolutely agree that we should have better measures for the parents. Unfortunately, even though we have brilliant data in Norway, they only started with these national tests in 2007 and with grades in about 2002, 2003. So these type of measures going back in time, we don't have them for the parent generation. But I think like any attempt at getting at that good quality data that you can take back in time and link to other data, it really is giving us this rich data that we can look at, and that process is happening in many countries now that they're getting access to registered data. And I think a lot of new findings and mechanisms are going to show up from that. Yeah.
If Norway took part in PIAC, and I don't remember it did.
We did, but they didn't allow us to link.
Yeah.
So we have that issue with PISA and TIMSS and PIAC that we only have the data, but it's not linkable. So for some reason we weren't allowed to do that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Other questions? Joan, you look like you're going to raise your hand. I'll come back to Tina. Go ahead, Joan. No, Joan. Joan, you jumped in.
Good morning. This is really interesting. I'm wondering, can you talk to us a little bit about how you understand what is low income really a proxy for in Norway that might be separate and distinct from what low income is often a proxy for in the US, given the different context of Norway?
Yeah, so we often operate in Norway, like we've seen a trend in the past that increasing child poverty in Norway, but that's the relative increase in child poverty, so it's a relative income measure. So as the median income is increasing, there are more children that maybe fall below that poverty measure. And so I think in Norway we often think of the poverty measure as not being able to be included in society in the same way that others are, rather than not being able to afford your basic needs. So being able to participate in after-school activities, being able to live with enough square meter area, and all these type of things that have something to do with your income relative to the rest of the population where you're living. So it's that, but we're also, I think, seeing a slight tendency in the absolute increase in child poverty as well. So it's not just relative poverty. But I think, yeah, I mean, it is a Nordic country with a welfare state, so poverty would mean something different to us. But I think even so, like it's just like with the education system, it's interesting to see what these trends look like for a country that's also doing a lot right with that group and with helping with poverty reduction through national programs. Yeah.
So it's incredibly interesting. The first thing I'm thinking about when you say parental income and education is the difference between the mother and the father. And curious if you guys separated that out. And in Norway, is it that like here more women are in the workforce over time? I also understand that here there's been studies that say that the mother's education has a level of education has more of an influence on students than the father. So just curious if you saw any differences.
Yeah, so now we take the highest level of education for any parent, and then we just take the average income the past 3 years before they take the test for parental income. And so if you're in a single parent household, that would just be the one income. But if you have two parents, then you have both of the incomes from the parents you were born with, not necessarily the parents you live with. So that's kind of a simple measure. But I think this is a descriptive sort of view of what it looks like in that moment. And I think going in and seeing which type of education matters more, but at the same time, this is not causal. So I would use other designs to try to get at that, to see which would matter more for children. But yeah, in the Norwegian context, most women are working, and so you do usually have dual households with earning, but not necessarily at the bottom of the distribution. Yeah.
It's something I think relevant for both Henry's and Tina's question. Astrid mentioned the greater separation of human and financial capital in Norway, meaning level of education is much less correlated with level of income in Norway than it is in the US. Just another piece of this, it's correlated about 0.3 in Norway, somewhere 0.3, 0.4. Almost all national databases in the US somewhere between 0.7 and 0.8. Very intertwined US and less so.
Yeah.
But yes, thank you, Astrid. So Nicolai, we have you up on the screen. You should be able to share your screen and take it away. I'm going to kind of stand.
Yeah, I need to make sure. So, do you see my screen now?
We see kind of a version of a presenter view.
Yeah, okay, sorry. We tested this a bit earlier, but now it's... Let me try again.
Henrik warned us that just because it came out in the testing doesn't mean it's going to work now.
No.
There you go.
Better?
Now you have it, yes.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So thank you. So the starting point of this paper is the well-known fact that the association between achievement and parental income and achievement varies considerably by sorry, I think it's something. Sorry about this. Okay, so let me begin again. So the starting point of this paper is the well-known finding that children's school achievement varies considerably by family background, such as parental income, as shown here. So what we do in this paper is to examine how this association between parental income and test scores varies across schools. So there's several kind of reasons to expect that this association varies across schools. For example, schools may differ in that they're able to recognize and sufficiently help students who struggle in schools. And since there are more learning difficulties in low-income families, this difference between schools may influence the parental income achievement association. And there's also a lot about reasons to expect this income achievement association to vary across schools. For example, it might be school differences in what is valued in peer culture, which could be more influential for low SES children. And we may also expect that parents' responses may differ across schools. So if the learning environment is bad, for example, a lot of substitute teachers or disciplinary problems, some parents may be more likely to invest additional efforts as a compensatory response. And this type of response is likely vary by family background. And finally, we could also kind of expect it to be confounding factors. So perhaps families with low income sourcing to high achieving schools have also other characteristics that affect the association between income and test scores. And in that case, the variation in income achievement association is not caused by the school environment, but the sorting in schools. So our main goal of this paper is to describe how the income achievement association varies across school, which is kind of what I've showed some results for today. And secondarily, we also in going forward, we also want to say more about whether this association and whether the variation across schools is causal, and also if it's causal, what kind of characterizes the schools that have a low or a high association with income test scores. And to examine this, we use population-wide emission register data with birth cohorts born between 1997 and 2007. And the outcome is measured at the beginning of 8th grade, which is in the beginning of lower secondary school, and it is the average of standard national test in reading and math. And the main predictor is parental income, which we measure when the child is between 10 and 12 years old. And this parental income measure is percentile ranking, and then divided by 10, which gives a median of 5 in the range from 0 to 10. We also tested with measuring parental income earlier before starting school, and we get basically the same results. And to estimate the variation across schools, we use a two-level random slope model, where we allow the association to vary randomly across schools. And where we also allow the random slope and then to make it exactly correlated. And the nice thing about using this type of random slope model is that it's kind of agnostic towards what specific traits of the school are, so we don't need to measure the peer culture or teacher qualifications. Instead, we just see how it varies across schools. And based on this model, we predict the random intercepts and the random slopes, which is what I will show you next. So what we've done here is that we first estimated the two-level random slope model, and we predicted the random slope and intercept, and then we can plotted these results. So let me go through each of these panels one by one. So first in panel A, we just plot the distribution of the random slopes. So on average, 1 decile increase in parental earnings is associated with an increase in test scores in Norway by about 12% of standard deviation. So we see that this association varies considerably across schools. So in panel B, we just take these random slopes and sort them from the highest to the lowest, and then plot the value of the slope of different quantities of the distribution. And we see that in the schools with the weakest association, only income decile is associated with less than 8% of the standard deviation increase in test scores. When we look at the schools at the top of the distribution, the 1% schools with the strongest association, this association is about 0.19, so more than twice as large. And we can also translate these random slopes into R squared, which gives us how much parental income explains of the variation in test scores in different schools. And I haven't shown the results there, but if you do this exercise, it reveals that parental income explains about 60% of the variations in test scores in the multiple equal schools. The schools up there, well, it explains only 2% of the variation in test scores in the most equal schools. So now, turning to panel C, this beam scatter plot illustrates that there is a negative correlation between the interslope and slope. And this negative correlation means that the association between parental income and test scores is smaller in schools with a high achievement level. So this is our school kind of with a high achievement level, and the association is stronger in schools with low achievement level. And finally, this last panel just shows the slopes for the different schools which shows that just that varies across schools. So we've kind of established that the income achievement association vary across schools. So the question is whether this reflect causal effects, that schools somehow moderate the association, or whether the variation is just driven by differential sorting into schools. So our ability to conclusively rule out confounding is limited, and this is kind of part of what we want to kind of develop when we go further in this paper. But to examine this possibility, we have estimated so-called value-added models, where we estimate the change in test scores from 5th to 8th grade by conditioning on 5th grade test scores in our baseline random float model. And this isn't the perfect solution to the confounding problem, but the advantage of estimating this change always that we can location has similar achievement level in 5th grade, and thereby control for a lot of sorting into different schools. And a couple of points worth keeping in mind is that when we look at the change score from 5th to 8th, the association is lower for two different reasons. So one is that just looking at 3 years of exposure compared to 7 years. So basically look at the change from 5th to 8th rather than from the exposure during the entire primary school. And second part of the association that we see between the parental income and test scores are explained by differences that occur early in life, so before starting school. So bearing this in mind, we find the same tendencies when we look at this change from 5th to 8th grade. So first there's variation across schools, which you see in panel A, and the association is twice as large in schools with the most unequal schools compared to the most equal schools. And it's also this same kind of pattern as we saw earlier, that the schools that have basically have a large value added from 5th to 8th grade is the same schools where the association is small, while the schools that have a low value added from 5th to 8th grade is also the schools where we see that there's a larger association between parental income and achievement, or change in achievement. And finally, in the last panel here, we see that the schools that the slope in the schools that have a large change from 5th to 8th is the same schools where it's a strong association between parental income and association all over. So, just to kind of let me briefly conclude. So we find that the association between parental income and test scores is very considerable across schools, and interestingly, the association is much stronger in low-performing schools than in high-performing schools. And our result can highlight how inequality in school achievement emerges through interaction between parental characteristics and school context. And optimistically, some schools are very successful in the sense that there's basically no association between parental income and test scores in these schools. And if we could identify the characteristics of these successful schools, these schools where family risk factors remain unmanifested, then perhaps we could get a better understanding of how these associations develop, and perhaps this knowledge might also be used to inform policy that can reduce achievement inequality. So, yeah, thank you.
I think the microphone for Nicolai is up here. Nicolai, if you can't hear questions, I'll try to repeat them, but questions for Nicolai? I have one for you, Nicolai. If you had to summarize the practical importance of these findings, first, that there's variability in the relation between what you're finding, just the variability itself, and then your part two, like what's the take-home practical message here?
Yeah, so if I understand your question correctly, so I think like it's interesting that this association varies so much between schools, and we've seen the same. We have another paper, you know about a bit about that, Eric, where we see the same for ADHD polygenic scores, and we also looked a bit at gender differences across schools, and the fact that all of these, both kind of genetics and family background and also other characteristics, the association between these characteristics and the test scores varies that much across schools means that that some of these associations are malleable. It's possible to change and reduce them. So I think like that's kind of the value of it. But it's of course kind of understanding what in the school, like for the ADHD paper that Rosa Schisman wrote, she didn't really find out why there was this variation across schools. So that's to be really policy relevant, you have to know kind of what are the characteristics of the schools, and that's kind of the tougher question, I guess.
Well, I think juxtaposing these two papers, so you have one that's showing growing achievement gaps no matter what Norwegian schools do in some sense, right? It generalizes across. But there's variability among schools in how big the achievement gap is in those schools. So some schools, and as your analysis suggests, it's not all about parental selection into those schools. So some schools must be doing something right? So it might not be something about the policy so far, but that doesn't mean there's not something that schools can do. That's my take-home message. If I could add one on there. Anybody else want to offer their take-home message or a question? Yeah.
I guess a question then about context. I know that there's much more of a national system in Norway, but how much control is there at school level? So if schools are doing things differently, who is deciding what's driving those differences?
Nicolai, could you hear that question?
Could you repeat it, Eric?
Yeah. So, and Katie, fix it if I get it wrong here. But given, in essence, the question is, who has the school level control of what happens in schools? And so, in the U.S., for example, we think about the role of federal policy, state policy, district leaders, and a school principal who has a lot of control around what happens in her or his school. In Norway, who has control over what's happening in these schools that might lead to this variability?
Yeah.
Is that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah. So I think maybe even Astrid will film me out if I say something stupid now. I guess like this also, compared to the US, I guess that's much less variation in schools. More of the differences between schools are smaller. But there are municipality level differences, and of course
municipalities are like counties. Like we can think about them kind of like as counties. So more municipality level control in Norway.
Yeah, there are some. Yeah.
I would.
And also, do you have any?
Yeah, no, the principals as well. They have a lot to say in each school. So as long as you're fulfilling the national norms for the curriculum and you're fulfilling the national norms for the number of teachers per student and those type of things, then they have autonomy both in how they spend their money, and also teachers have a great autonomy in the classroom, what curriculum they choose to use. So all of this is creating a lot of variation across schools within that context.
That's super helpful. Marion,
related to that, maybe also I wonder how the teacher market works. So here in the US, we do know that certain teachers have incentives, it seems, to be in certain types of schools, so more senior teachers than to be in the wealthier, quieter schools. So how does the teacher market work?
Can teachers select in the schools that are great schools?
So do you want,
Or Nicolai, I don't know if you heard the question, Nicolai, but it's basically, are there teacher selection effects that are accounting for some? Are there great teachers going into these schools that are leading to smaller achievement gaps, I think is another way of asking. Like, but the more literal question was, what's the market like for teachers today?
Yeah. So it's, again, I guess, I think Astrid will answer this question first.
I can try. But there's definitely like differences in, it's easier to recruit teachers in cities than it is to recruit, like we have a huge recruitment problem in these small, Norway's a large country with very sparse population, and getting teachers to these places is hard. So you will have differences in that, but when we have a little bit of the same issue, I think, with the US, like when we look at the how you measure teacher quality, like with the measures we have in the data, we don't actually find that variable that shows who's a good teacher, right? It doesn't really matter which teacher education you had. It's hard to identify what makes someone good in the classroom with the register data we have available. But yeah, there are definitely, it's more likely that you'd find a good teacher in a city than further out. But also our data in Norway, even though it's great, it actually doesn't link students to teachers. So there's a lot we don't know about teacher value added type measures, because it's all like the furthest we can get down is actually a school value added type measure. So I think actually when it comes to the effect of teachers, the US has much better, and other countries have much more better data at answering those type of questions than what we can do. Yeah.
One more question?
Can I also add, sorry.
Go ahead, Henrik, go ahead.
I was just going to add that a colleague of ours has been doing some very rigorous research on school value added modeling in Norway, and high level school value added is very weakly correlated with socioeconomic background in the schools. So it doesn't seem to be a kind of richer kids go to schools which provide them better learning.
But it could be a little bit different than whether richer, quote unquote, teachers do.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's just one additional information adding to that.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, another question?
Oh, yeah, just getting into the intersection between the two, it's research we've heard today. Curious also what in Norway the selection or school matching process looks like on the front end. How are students, certainly in areas with school choice, how is that piece happening on the ground in Norway?
I don't know if you hear that, Nicolai, but it's basically, how does school choice happen in Norway? What do families select their schools? If they do, how do they do that? What are the constraints around that?
Yeah, so in primary school, which we study in this paper, is based on where you live, basically the neighborhood you live, and almost all children attend the local school, and so it's about sorting into neighborhoods, and in the big cities, of course, there's a lot of sorting into, there are a lot of differences between neighborhoods, and yeah, so there's quite a lot of variation there.
So what's happening in neighborhoods is what's happening in schools in Norway. Yeah. Excellent. Thank you. Okay, I think we'll transition to Gülbin's talk, and I think Diane's setting up some snacks over there. Please feel free to help yourself. I might get a drink.
Shall I start?
Yes, please start.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Gülbin, and I'm so thrilled to be here today to share my research with you. My talk is about the double jeopardy of low family income and the negative emotionality, and this is the study that we revisited the family stress model. So we just simply asked why family income matter for the young children, and then because we know that the family environment plays a very important role in children's life, and because it predicts the various children's developmental outcomes, such as their physical well-being, psychosocial well-being, or the academic achievement. But we also know that many families also struggle to provide a stable and a nurturing environment for their children. So we also know that family income matters more during the early childhood compared to the other developmental periods. So we just simply asked what would be the reason behind it, and we come up with the our classical family stress model. And then because the family stress model provides us a very, here is the very typical one that we can frame how we frame the family stress model. It provides us a very nicely shaped theoretical framework to link the family income with the children's developmental outcomes. So we have built our theoretical foundation on these very well established family stress model, and we just simply ask what if the pathways that we draw here, explained by the family stress model, do not show the equal importance for all children and all families? What if the children children's unique characteristics, get under the skin of the family processes, and they have a role in shaping the family mechanisms here? So, so that was the point that we decided to revisit the model again, because we know that the children are active in evoking and responding to the caregiver behaviors, because in the family members engage in reciprocal interactions with each other, they act and react. So this means that children may be actively influence and respond to the caregiver behaviors, therefore they may have an impact on the strength of the effects proposed by the family stress model. So, but when we explore go into deeper in the family stress literature, we observe that the uneven impact of the environmental conditions on the children has been usually identified as an area of the future research, but it has not been very directly hypothesized and tested before. So relying on this missing piece in the family stress model, we have revisited the model again, arguing that the children's negative emotionality could influence the way that the family financial hardship influences their psychosocial outcomes. So this is our own way of how we frame our family stress model in our Norwegian sample. Here we have proposed 3 different hypotheses, and each corresponding to the different parts of the model. And then each hypothesis here, like we call it double jeopardy hypothesis, compounded stress, and that is a stress hypothesis, which I will come in a minute for the details. It's clearly linked with a specific scenario, so that you can much more easily understand what's happening here. So now we have seen the figure, and then it's, I think, time to explore what it can tell us about the role of child negative emotionality. This is the compounded stress hypothesis. We simply here say that, okay, low family income puts an extra toll on the parents. It dysregulates how they cope with the difficulties in their in the family environment, but on the top of this economic struggles. If they also parenting to a highly negative emotionality children, the stress can may compound, and then family mechanisms may get worse. So here we say that the combination of the stress associated with the low family income and the challenges associated with having a child with higher negative emotionality in concert affects the family mechanisms. And here is our second model is represented by the blue arrows on the left-hand side of the figure. We just simply inspired by our typical stress model, and we say that okay, some individuals are more prone to display maladaptive outcomes when they expose to environmental stressors, and this is because of the biological vulnerability or temperamental issues. So here we, by relying on these stress thinking, we just say that the family mechanisms on the one hand and the children's behavior outcomes on the other hand, and the link between these two might be much more stronger for those who have higher negative emotionality. And then this is our double jeopardy hypothesis, our third hypothesis. It simply says that if we see the both compounded stress and the dietary stress hypothesis is supported in the model, we simply call it double jeopardy. In the double jeopardy model, income affects parenting, and the parents and the parenting differentially as a function of child negative emotionality, and behavior problems in children with high levels of negative emotionality are more strongly influenced by the parent and parenting practices. So here we thought that we argue that when economic difficulties combined with a negative family environment and a child's impulsive tendencies, it may result in double jeopardy. So this is how we are very research aim. The first is whether we will be able to replicate the findings that we found in our general family stress model in Norway. And the second is target is that whether we will be able to find the support for our three hypothesized models. And we drove our sample from the Norwegian mother, father, and child cohort study. It's a kind of a population-based pregnancy cohort study. We pull out our measures from the mother's reports on when the children are 1.5, 3, and 5-year-old. And we also include the cohorts who were born between 2004 and 2008, and we ended up with slightly very close to the 80,000 children. And we pull out the income information from the National Register of Norway. And here is how our structural model looks like all groups included. And it's very nicely shaped and very well fitted to the data. And but we concluded that we just find a partial support for the family stress model because the link between the relationship satisfaction and the children's internalizing problems turn out to be not significant, but the other indirect effects goes through the parental locus of control and the maternal distress or the joint effect were nicely and indirectly predicting the link between family income and the children's behavior problems. And here is our multi-group analysis that we simply test the moderating role of children's negative emotionality in the family stress model. And the first part of the figure shows that we found a significant path between the significant group differences between for the association between the family income and the maternal distress. We just saw that the one standard deviation increase in the family income is associated with around 15% of standard deviation lower levels of maternal distress in the group of children with higher negative emotionality. And regarding the autism stress part, which is seen here as the blue arrow, and one standard deviation higher scores on the maternal distress was associated with slightly 19% of the standard deviation higher scores on the higher scores on the internalizing problems for children who score high on the negative emotionality. And when we look at the results, where we found the support for the double jeopardy hypothesis, we actually found one. This is the code that we frame it like a specific kind of a double jeopardy because there was something going on special on the indirect effect of maternal distress. The path from family income through the maternal distress to the internalizing problems differed significantly between the children who rated children rated as having higher versus lower emotional reactivity. So this was the support for the specific double jeopardy effort. So when we look at just carefully inspect whether we will be able to find the significant group differences on the indirect effects in the model, we actually found a couple of significant indirect effects across groups. The path from the family income to the problem behaviors through the joint effect of maternal distress and the lack of locus of control were also different across the groups. And for all paths, the children who score higher on the negative emotionality their effect sizes were significantly much higher than the lower group. Although the effect sizes are a little bit smaller in magnitude across the problem behaviors, and the joint indirect effect of maternal distress and the marital satisfaction was also found to be significantly different across temperament groups. So if we just want to wrap up, we just found the consistent results with the original family stress model literature, so we will be able to replicate the findings, our Norwegian data set. We also found that the maternal distress appeared as the most silent family mechanisms, followed by the lack of locus of control, and the marital satisfaction appeared as the weakest indirect family mechanisms. And the further results also lighted the moderational association of the family stress model by just introducing the child negative emotionality as a potential moderator. The high negative emotionality here emerged as a challenging child characteristic, which loads a kind of additional stress on the parents, and those parents were already emotionally overwhelmed by the family, overwhelmed by the economic difficulties. So we just simply conclude that the family processes do not function equally for all families and for all children. So, and our double jeopardy hypothesis simply suggested that the individuals who experience both low income and the high levels of negative emotionality are at a greater risk for the negative outcomes than those who experience either one alone. So the families with children on higher negative emotionality experience double jeopardy because of the a kind of a emotional tribulation caused by the low income and the continued adversities in the family environment. So overall, we just simply say that the risks associated with the highly stressed family environments accumulates the adversities for families, and especially for the families with children on higher negative emotionality, because difficult temperament puts children as well as the parents in a vulnerable position, making them particularly more fragile to the environmental challenges, as well as more reactive to the external adversities. So we just simply say that it might be very important to consider the cumulative stress experience even within the family stress model framework. It also might be very important as well to consider how children perceive and react to stress, especially for the children who grow up in low-income families. So this is basically what I can share with you. Thank you so much.
Questions?
Very quick.
Go ahead, and then maybe
Very quick. I wonder how old is the kids you are looking at? Young children in your sample.
It was a kind of a longitudinal sample. I think I just missed the.
Well, there's something at the top.
Yeah. For the family income, we basically kind of average the family income in the first 3 years. It's a kind of a longitudinal structural equation modeling, but it does not lack the previous measures. So for the for the family stressors in the middle, for the indirect effects were measured when the children were 3-year-old age, and the outcome variables were measured when the children were 5-year-old.
Yeah, I was really fascinating to see the impact in such a younger group of children.
Yeah.
And also because there are a lot of my findings shows that the poverty or the family income have really impact the parents, their own cognitive functioning, and their mental capacities, and that really see that pass to the children.
Yeah. Yeah, that was one of the part that we are really impressed by the findings. I mean, this young population really influenced by the family income. So that was one of the strength of this study, I guess.
Lita.
I just wondered if in your data set you have access to variables that you might be able to look at as moderators between family income and terms of distress that could be used to inform policy. So participation in parenting groups, distance of their workplace from home, number of other siblings, anything that might attenuate that relationship between family income and terms of distress. Is there anything you could possibly explore in the future?
That it might be, but from the way that we frame this model and given the availability of these statistical techniques that we apply in this model, I think it can be kind of hard to tell how we can really put these in practical senses. So I think that the thing that we're doing here in this study is just more like a theoretical contribution to the field, not the kind of a very practical on the level. I cannot say anything.
But I
For now, at
bet
least.
this is the beauty of having practitioners in the room.
Yeah.
So I think the question for the practitioners is also, so if you, in the model, what Gülbin is showing us is that family income affects maternal distress in a much greater way for children who are reactive emotionally. And maternal distress affects externalizing and internalizing problems much more so for children who are emotionally reactive. In other words, all children growing up poor are not the same, and the impacts of income on the mothers, at least, maybe parents, but certainly mothers, and then the impact of the parenting on the child varies as a function of child characteristics. So I asked, well, throw her scarf. Well, I asked, yeah.
Understanding that it's theoretical, I was just wondering if you had any variables that you might explore, like if some of these mothers had access to support networks or had access to early intervention because the child's externalizing behaviors were identified earlier. Does that attenuate the relationship?
Does the MOBA have any data?
Yeah, not the mobile, maybe register data. Maybe we can pull out some, I'm not sure. Astrid, do you have any?
I think it's definitely worth exploring more. I think, it's such a nice, I love this exercise in doing moderation within this model and like really exploring those different groups. So, and then of course this is one variable, but any variable that we can kind of
And I think that's what I'm asking the practitioners. What variables would you look for? Like, what would you think if you have child emotional reactivity compounding the impacts of poverty? What are the kinds of things that should be in terms of supports that should be offsetting that? And go.
Well, I was going to say, like, do you have other family support, number of siblings, like other, like there was a question that's like, you can imagine like the magnifying, right? Like if you're, if you're alone, like how much are you co-parenting versus really parenting solo? Yeah. Like even if there's another adult in the house.
Intergenerational support.
Yeah. We just, I think in this model, we just included a bunch of covariates, like a number of children in the family, number of adults in the family, what else, maternal education and so on, but it can be a kind of a different.
So it's kind of an all things being equal that way. You could add,
but you could, but if you have
more,
in the
more moderators.
Yeah, if you have in the model. Just do it.
Why not more moderators?
Yeah, we can just play with the data in a way that we do. So yeah, it's possible to do that.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, excellent. And
yeah. So thank you so much for inviting us to come here and present to you guys. I'm going to present an entire project, so it's going to be easy. But this is a project that we have. It's ongoing currently. We have translated it into English. New patterns, new safe upbringing, which is obviously not what it's called in Norwegian, but the meaning is the same. And we're a team of social workers, sociologists, economists, GPs, psychologists that collaborate with a team of social workers to implement these kind of interventions into the families in 2 municipalities in Norway. So I'm going to touch on some of the things that I hope you'll find interesting, and I'm very open to discuss and elaborate after the talk, because it's going to be hard to get it all in 10 minutes. But so we have a situation of increasing childhood poverty in Norway, and there's lots of suggestions that this could be helped by better coordination of the existing services. But we don't know that, but that's been sort of several trends of research suggest that this is maybe one of the ways that we could provide help better to these families by better coordination. So we're trying a model where we do that, and then we're also trying to evaluate whether that model is a sound way of providing services. We're not sort of introducing new services, we're just trying to better facilitate and coordinate the ones that we already have. And just to give you quite like a little backdrop, this is the situation with regards to the relative poverty situation in Norway. So we used the median income population, so the 60% of the median income equalized, and if you're below that, then you're counted as growing up in a poor family in Norway. So we have had an increase over the last decade, so we're close to 11% of children that meets these criteria, and it's a debate whether that is a lot or not, but in Norway we decided that it's too much and we want to do something about it. So that's sort of a way into this. And you all are aware of the possible threats to health and development of low-income situations, that children that grow up have a higher prevalence of various problems related to health and development. When we look at the existing services and we try to sort of ask families that receive those services about how they would improve them, they describe them as the current services as disintegrated, so maybe there's one family member who gets help in one service at a time. They're uncoordinated, so we don't see relationships between mental problems, economic problems, other social problems, participation problems. And the services are often described as being poorly fitted to the members' needs. So it's sort of like the service is providing the help that the service can provide without regarding what the family members actually need from that service. So with this intervention, we have very ambitious goals, but we're trying to sort of more short-term improve health and quality of life. We want to increase the activity levels in the family members. We want to try to get them to do stuff that could perhaps bring them closer to participating in work. We want to look at the children and see if there's something we can do to improve performance in school, put them in better housing, and improve their financial circumstances. And we also want to try to do something about intergenerational transfer of poverty, which we see is quite common among these families. So the intervention is sort of funded, which is a bit of a challenge, and I'll get into that, but there was a large funding scheme in Norway to devise or design these kind of interventions. So it was quite easy to get a lot of money to get the interventions going from the municipalities, not so easy to get the money to evaluate them. So there's a disconnect and there's a delay between when the intervention is rolling out, the municipality are just getting to work, and then the researchers are sort of running after it to try to do whatever we can with the stuff that the municipality has already rolled out, which has some strengths and also some, from a research perspective, there are some limitations that limit what we can do. But so we put 33 new hires in this Norwegian Labour and Welfare Organization, which is sort of the hub for where we provide welfare and social services to poor families, but also where we get on pensions and parental leave money, stuff like that. So it's like a hub of welfare and social services. So we get 33 new people into those services. And their job was to coordinate and tailor these existing services and also connect new ones, like if there's problems, having birthday parties at home, there's volunteer organizations that can come into the home and do that for the family. So they connect to those kinds of services. And each coordinator is responsible for 10 families, which is 10% of the usual workload of all of the social workers, which is a key, which is I think is key. And they follow them up for 5 years. So it's a sort of a long-term relationship that is being established between these family coordinators and the families. And we're centering on the kids, but every member of the family is part of the intervention. So how the family gets into the intervention is that, say, a teacher is concerned about this kid, and they can anonymously discuss this case with a multidisciplinary team of practitioners and some researchers that discuss this case and then say, well, I think this person can be helped within existing families, existing services, if you do this and this and this. And they can say, no, okay, we can accept this family into the program. And then they're identified, which is a problem. So we don't know anything about the people who do not get into the problem, which is like a research challenge, but that's how the municipality designed the intervention, and we're not allowed to change that. So basically, to sum up the intervention, it is basically receiving help coordinated by this family coordinator, which is like on this little figure. Yeah, this is the family coordinator. And then versus treatment as usual, which is just the family going all into these services on their own. Yeah, I think that will give you sort of a bit of an overview. And in the research project, we're trying to do 3 things, because the projects that got funded from this scheme, that had sort of one of the criteria for being funded was that they could be scaled up and made national programs if they were successful. So therefore we are having a package that is also sort of looking at how is this stuff running in the ordinary services in Norway. I'll present some just like a glimpse of results from all of these 3 areas. So the first one is more like a quantitative package where we try to we survey these families every year at intake and annually, and we connect that information to register information about concurrent information about how they do in school and the family's economic situation, their housing, which services they're getting, how much money they're getting, etc. And we also connect into a long-term follow-up. So in 15 years, we're going to find these kids in the register, and we're comparing them to the kids in the same areas that didn't get intervention to see if we can see anything long-term effects going on. Because we're hoping maybe that they complete school more or something like that, maybe get employment. Those are the kind of targets we're going to be looking at in 15 years' time. In the second work package, we're working with ethnographers. I've never done that before. It's so exciting. So they're just sort of following people around, taking notes. So we're sort of saying, how is this actually being implemented in the services and in the meetings between the workers, social workers and the families, etc. We also do interviews with the families, so we have a sort of a quantitative approach. And then we also are doing the implementation stuff. We're surveying other services. How is the implementation of new patterns affecting the other services in the area where it has been implemented? And then so we track them annually. And then we also were hit by the pandemics, so we had a couple of years, but then we were able to use the existing infrastructure. So we actually had better access to these families than most other families that were poor and had need for welfare system, because everything shut down. But we had a channel with these families that proved very useful. So the participants, well, this is Norway on the top right, and then all the way to the south is where the intervention has been put in place. So there's 12 municipalities participating. 243 families have so far been recruited. So there's a bit of descriptives there. Some of the families are big, so we have a 50-50 balance of ethnic minority families or migrant families, and we're oversampling Norwegian families. So that's not representative of the poverty situation in Norway. But we don't know much about the Norwegian families' experience, or the ethnic Norwegian families. This is the terminology that I'm struggling with. But those are born in Norway, and they are. There are some suggestions from other research that those families have a more complex situation than the migrants. So we wanted to oversample to have a better look at that. So we had some questions about what does it mean to be of low income in Norway, and we have some descriptive that might shed some lights on that. So 88% of them live in rented housing, 50%, like I said, have migrant backgrounds, and that's on the family. So we have more children from migrant backgrounds because the families are on average a bit larger. 63% of them are in single parent household, 48% have stopped at elementary education, and 80% almost are out of paid employment. So this is the sample we were sort of working on, And there are complex circumstances. So 54% are in contact with child protection services. There's 33% who are in contact with services for mental health and or substance use disorders. And these are primarily the ethnic Norwegian participants. And all families depend on a combination of many different sources of income and economic support schemes. So this is there will be no exam, but this is just a brief overview of the surveys that we include, and this is also in the published paper, so you might be able to pull that out of there if you want to. But we have some mental health instruments, strengths and difficulties questionnaire. We have the KID screen for health-related quality of life, the register data, and we also have some measurements about self-efficacy and health of the parents that we expect in the survey.
It's
Yeah.
not your fault, but we've got about 6 minutes. I want to make sure you have time for questions.
Yeah,
So
I'm
maybe-
at 6 minutes now.
No. We have about 6 minutes in the entire session left.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
No, it's not your fault though.
All right. Yeah. No,
It's
but
not-
a percentage. Yeah.
Henrik and I were both over time, and it just messed you up.
Okay, but that's fine. Yeah. So that's a paper, and I can give you the reference so you can have that if you want. So, yeah, this is a funny figure, but when you go into a municipality that is just like existing like it always does, and you're trying to do research, it's like a complex intervention, right? There's everything is moving. There are all these targets, and they're all moving, and you're moving. So this is something called a logic map, which is how we try to navigate these situations. And we try to tie what are we doing with what is happening, what are we observing, to sort of help us keep sort of think properly about this intervention. So it's not a causal map. Some findings. Well, we see that participants that have good health-related quality of life, they have many mental health problems, and especially the Norwegian participants have many mental health problems. The migrants, much lower rates of mental health problems, and also lower rates of parental mental health problems. So this is, I'm just going to go into this then, I'm going to skip that. We're seeing that they have a lot of unpredictable payouts, which is causing them a lot of stress, and it's also preventing them from doing a proper financial planning. So they get some money one week, and that's deducted from the other money that comes the following week. So it's really chaotic, and it's really hard for them to navigate their income sources. And they also have income from many different sources that all have their own sort of schemes of when they're being paid out and etc. We actually just got this paper accepted, or we described this in the Nordic Journal of Social Research, so you will be able to read more about it. And we also see some service changes, they change the benefits they receive, and they use less of some services and more of other services, which are sort of indicative of like more of the services that we would like them to use and fewer of the ones that we don't. And we also see that this is like the survey I described around the surrounding services or connected services, that people are less worried about the family. They think that the services are being more sort of appropriately targeting the families. And also some of them are experiencing reduced workloads. We don't know if this is good or bad. We're trying to find more about that. If child protection thinks somebody else is dealing with it, then we need to make sure that somebody else is actually dealing with the problem before we can say this is a nice finding. So it's been a rush. We have a good website, and it's Google Translate supported, so you can read about it. And thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tormod. Sorry to push you into such a rush there, but questions? I know there's got to be a lot of familiar logic models for City Connects folks, but Daksoon, jump in.
Yeah, I wonder, I think it's a very expensive program, in my opinion. One coordinator taking care of 10 families comparing to City Connect, we take care of one coordinator take care of a lot of students. So I don't know, have you ever done about cost-benefit analysis? Because it's expensive program. I don't know how it can be general to other work. That was my one question. And then another question is about, again, another studies too, I heard about, they define about low income, and I'm just really curious about how you really define low income in Norwegian, because in the United States, usually we call it as a free lunch kids, but I don't know, how do you really define low income? I think it's quite different than how we define here. So there might be a gap of how we understand the study. So those are kind of the general kind of defining those terms to understand other people from outside of Norway.
Yeah, well, I can say that the cost-benefit analysis is one of the things that we will look into. So, but I don't have any answers to you. It is an expensive intervention, but if it gets these kids through education and into work, then it can be a pretty expensive intervention and it still makes sense. So we sort of, but that's part of the stuff that we will be working on. But we need to see the long-term effects to have something to measure.
So my question was, so that is how can be general to other world, like who cannot afford that amount of money. So this study might be useful, it's a great study, but then how other countries can understand and then get some implication from this study?
Well, if we find out that this is sort of, I don't know, it's probably not what the answer you want to, but if this is what it takes, then that will give us an answer. And then you can say, well, we're willing to invest this much money into this part of the population, or not. I think it basically comes down to whether you're willing to. And if this is working, then well, that's one solution: is giving people more time to help these families with all their complexities, because that might be one of the essential factors.
And it's happening. If we look at Durham Connects being scaled in the city of Durham, North Carolina, very similar programs being implemented. How expensive they are? Yeah, I think but in terms of cost-benefit analysis, I think it'll be interesting to know, because if it could end up being savings or not. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's an open question. Yeah.
Other questions? Yeah, Katie.
I'm interested in, so the fact that you found better outcomes for immigrant families is, I think if we did that in the US, we would see very different patterns. So,
yeah. Well, we were a bit surprised about that, but in some ways, when you talk to the families, which is really the sort of mixed methods coming out, it's like there's less complexities, because this is the poverty measures based on having income below 60% of the median population income. So you have a combination of migrant families and with lower participation in the labor market and higher families. So like the way the poverty measure is calculated is the disposable income divided by the number of people who are going to use it, to live off it. So they sort of, in some ways, they just need a job, some of these families, and a bit more money, and then that would solve lots of their problems. But the ethnic Norwegian families, there's much more, there's like the third generation of poor, like they lived in a welfare state for 3 generations, they haven't been able to take advantage of it. So there's something more going on that prevents them from doing this. And you also have this healthy migrant effect, that the migrants that arrive in Norway might be on average a bit more healthy than both the population in Norway and where they come from. But then you should see a change with the second generation, and we have some of those, but there's not many enough of them to be able to do proper detailed analysis. But that could be 2 of the suggestions. Yeah.
Just to follow up to these questions.
No, it's 11 o'clock, so people do need to go, but go ahead, you can stay. But
something in particular about that, like what's the structure of the families that you're working with, particularly the Norwegian families, because 10 members, so I was wondering, is it like a parent plus children, or are you including also these intergenerations, like different generations?
No, it's parents and their children and their parents.
Okay.
Yeah.
And is there a way also to account like for the extended family and how the family also contributes to?
I don't think we would have to survey like retrospectively in a way, but.
The other question that I have,
because
I was just wondering if it's so difficult to coordinate with like the program and then the evaluation of the program, how are you doing with the data collection, like just to gather all the information that you need to then evaluate?
No, that's fine, because family coordinators are also helping us with the data collection.
Okay.
But what if we could reset or move back in time, that especially the recruitment procedure, I would like to know about the families that are getting turned down. How dissimilar are they from those who are being accepted? Because that's a really key question that we're not able to. We can do matching in the registers, but yeah, it would be better to have a proper control group, which is a big problem. And that's because it's like a race. Like when we start intervention, you start getting funding for research.
Yeah. And research isn't always the biggest priority, right?
Yeah.
Well, thank you to each of our speakers for visiting literally or digitally from Norway.